In the absence of Fuchida, overall command of the morning's attack had fallen on Hiri's Hik Taich, Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi. He was a handsome, serious man with high cheekbones and forehead and piercing dark eyes. Somewhat aloof and known as a hard drinker, he was a recent addition to Hiri's air unit, although he was a veteran of the air war over China. This was, however, his first combat sortie against the Americans. He mounted plane BI-310, along with his observer, Lieutenant Hashimoto Toshio, and radioman PO-1C Murai Sadamu. The pilots began checking their mounts, the engine's condition, and the movement of the flaps, rudder, and stabilizers. One by one, each man raised his hand, shouting, "Isor! Okay!" to the deck crewmen still huddled about. The drone of the engines grew louder as throttles were boosted. The deck launching officer, Sho Hik HA, a subordinate to the carrier's Hike HHAE, who was in charge of flight deck operations, was making the rounds of the strike aircraft, checking each individual plane to make sure that all was in readiness. Akagi's Hik Chaich, Commander Masuda, watched from the air control station on the aft portion of the island. He could see his She Hik running back to the air station, and as he did so, Masuda barked into the voice tube up to the bridge that all was in readiness for takeoff. Akagi was steaming at battle speed 3, 22 knots. At that moment, the wind was from 160 degrees at 2 meters per second, 4 knots. One by one, in the dim light of dawn, each carrier in the force raised her seibiki, service flag, and simultaneously signalled to Akagi via blinker that all was in readiness. Akagi, in turn, raised signal flags and blinkered to the force, indicating Kei Gekitai Hashin Junbiyoshi, attack force ready to launch. At the head of Akagi's deck spot were the 9 Type 0 fighters commanded by later Shirane Ayao. The son of an important politician, Shirane had been with Akagi since the first day of the Pacific War. Now, upon seeing the signal flags being raised, he looked over his shoulder at the planes packed behind him. He could see the other 8 pilots in his own chutai, as well as the 3 combat air patrol fighters. Right aft of them was Akagi's full complement of Type 99 bombers under Lieutenant Yamada Shohei. He could see all the pilots had their hands raised, indicating readiness. He responded by turning on his wing lights. The other aircraft immediately followed suit. Akagi now signalled to the other ships, "Hashin II, prepare to launch." Some of the remaining deckhands untethered the wings of each plane and then ran for the crew shelters, leaving a pair of crewmen under each plane, tending the wheel chocks. Their white uniforms were buffeted in the cool, blustery prop wash, yet all the men kept their eyes on the Heike-chi. Now, nearly 2 hours after the crew had first gotten to work, all was finally in readiness. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo looked to Genda, who returned his gaze solemnly, then nodded. This was it. Nagumo then gave the order, "Keichikei Gekitai wo Hashinseo," launch the air attack force, which Genda immediately relayed via the speaker tube to Masuda at the air station. Simultaneously, Akagi's signal lamps began blinking to the other ships, instructing them to begin launching. Masuda now ordered the steam jet at Akagi's bow turned on to indicate the wind direction to the pilots. From his Zero's cockpit, Shiran could see the white vapour streaming down the flight deck. A glance up over his left shoulder at the windsock flying from Akagi's mainmast confirmed his impression. It was stiffly aligned almost fore and aft. Akagi's 41,000-ton bulk was charging ahead, her massive bow kicking up sheets of white water as her engines thrummed. In the east, the sky was beginning to lighten. It was 4:26. On the flight deck, the Hikch blew a whistle, then swung his red lantern in a great circle. On the bridge, Masuda used a signal lamp to alert all the planes on the deck to begin taking off. Simultaneously, another officer on the air platform began vigorously waving a white flag toward the direction of the bow. Having retreated to the side of the flight deck, the SH, Shike-Chi-H, then signalled to the deck crewmen to remove the wheel chocks, which they did before scurrying to the deckside shelters. Making a last-minute check behind him again, Shirane upped his throttle and yelled, Ikimasu! I'm going! His plane surged forward as Shirane gunned it. Within a few meters, his tail came off the deck and he charged ahead on his main gear alone. Some 80 meters later, his plane left the deck and hurtled into the air with a growl. Along the length of the deck, the crewmen in their shelters shouted encouragement and waved a veritable blizzard of white caps, wishing him good luck. Unlike Western navies, once the takeoff signal was given, it was up to the individual pilots to determine when to begin their own takeoff runs. One by one, each of Shirane's fighter division pilots repeated his maneuver, the outboard planes angling into the center line and then gunning it down the deck. It only took 10 to 15 seconds apiece. Akagi had begun launching first at 0426. Hyrie followed suit at 0428, with Kaga and SRI beginning operations at 0430. On board Hyrie, attack leader Lieutenant Tomonaga watched as her 9 escort fighters departed, led by the athletic and energetic Liltea's Shigematsu Yasuhiro. Right after them, 3 Zeros under Liltea's Mori Shigeru, whose Eshtai was leading the morning's first combat air patrol watch, departed with similar alacrity. Getting Tomonaga's Kank in the air, however, was a different story altogether. Fully loaded, his plane weighed more than 4 tons, almost 400 pounds more than a dive bomber, and more than a ton heavier than a Zero. Yet his horsepower-to-weight ratio was the lowest of the 3 types of carrier planes in the fleet. In a word, the Type 97 was a pig. He would need every ounce of power to make it off the deck. The compound wind over Hyrie's flight deck generally needed to be around 13 meters second, 26 knots, to launch aircraft, but Tomonaga's Type 97s really were better off if the relative wind was closer to 15 meters second, 30 knots. This created problems for the older Kaga, whose top speed of 28 knots, on a good day, meant that she could barely launch her Type 97s if there was no wind. Too much wind, though, could be a problem in itself. At speeds above 25 meters, just second, the planes were impossible to control on the flight deck. On Hyrie, creating relative wind wasn't an issue. Yamaguchi's flagship had plenty of speed. But even under ideal conditions, Tomonaga's heavily laden bird still needed around 120 meters to make it into the air. On the shorter flight decks of Hyrie and S-Rai, this was problematic, particularly for the lead strike aircraft spotted at the head of the pack. Under the circumstances, the only thing Tomonaga could do was jam his throttle all the way to the stops, pop the brakes, and hope for the best. If worse came to worst and he went into the drink, hopefully Hyrie wouldn't run over his plane. Then the guard destroyer would pluck him and his men to safety. He gunned his engine. His Kank began plodding down the deck, gaining speed with agonizing slowness. He could see his plane coming up on the white-painted wind gauge and the steam jet at the forward end of the flight deck. It was happening all too quickly. Then, seemingly at the last second, his plane nosed up and lifted grudgingly from Hyrie's deck. Cheers rang out again from the crew galleries. Tomonaga immediately began circling to port, putting his plane into a waiting pattern as the rest of his squadron took off. One by one, Hyrie's Kanktai, clutching their deadly cargoes to their bellies like great green dragons, lumbered into the air. Across the water, the other carriers were doing the same, sending their heavy attack planes up into the growing light. The last to leave the decks were a Type 97 Kank apiece from Kaga and Akagi. These 2 planes were slated to join the search missions that were already getting underway from the cruisers and battleships. The carriers completed launching their aircraft within about 7 minutes. Sure, here's the Passage formatted properly. Climbing up war, the various unit commanders gathered their forces together, merging them into a cohesive whole. Meanwhile, the patrol fighters and recon flights headed off to their respective tasks alone or in small groups. At 0445, the strike force turned as one and headed southeast toward Midway, at 125 knots, 108 aircraft all told. Had the Americans been able to observe this spectacle, they might well have been envious of the prowess of their foes. At this point in the war, the US Navy still struggled to mount a coordinated attack from a single flight deck, as the events of this day would soon demonstrate. The Japanese, by contrast, were able to launch and assemble a synchronized strike from as many as 6 carriers as a matter of course. They thought nothing of creating combat units assembled from physical elements of several carriers, an escort fighter group from all 4 carriers led by Kaga's senior fighter commander, a combined arms attack force, level and dive bombers, led by Tomonaga. It was a testament to the skill and training of the Japanese that they could accomplish such an impressive feat of arms. Nagumo stood watching his attack force depart. Once they were out of visual sight of the task force, they would be completely beyond his control. Radio silence would be maintained until the attack against Midway had actually been carried out, and the flight leader's radio man had the chance to tap out a brief preliminary report on his radio telegraph. Nagumo wouldn't really know the particulars of the strike results until Tomonaga and the others landed and were debriefed. Until then, his intelligence on the state of Midway would remain spotty. Such were the vagaries of command on board a 1940s carrier. The strike force, once launched, was on its own, and so too was Nagumo. Overhead, the Combat Air Patrol, CAP, of 11 fighters were fanning out to cover the fleet. Each shtai took a different quadrant of the sky. 2 shtai at 2,000 meters, the other 2 at 4,000. All in all, this was a fairly skimpy force to protect a fleet as large as Nagumo's. Yet Commander Masuda was already preparing Akagi's next deck spot. This time around it wouldn't be attack planes, but fighters. They would be needed for patrol operations as long as the air threat from Midway remained. A shtai of 3 CAP fighters had already gone up with the first attack wave. Another shtai was scheduled for launch within an hour. Kaga, Hyrie, and SRI had already contributed 2, 3, and 3 planes, respectively, to the CAP force as well. Up from Akagi's forward elevator came a brace of 9 fighters. Across the water, Commander Masuda could see the other carriers following suit, spotting and warming up additional fighters so they would be available at short notice. Even with all of the flight deck to work with, these aircraft were spotted well aft, to give the pilots as much runoff room to work with as possible. Hyrie's fighter contingent had to be rolled out of the way almost immediately after being spotted, though, as Yamaguchi's flagship sighted one of her own planes in difficulty. Ensign Akamatsu Saku's torpedo bomber had developed engine trouble and had to abort. He came limping back and was recovered without further incident. Meanwhile, in the forward magazines of Akagi and Kaga, armourers had begun dragging 17-foot-long torpedoes from their stacked storage racks in order to arm the reserve strike aircraft. The Type 91 Maurauder III was the latest addition to the aerial arsenal of a navy that had elevated torpedo attack into an art form. Each carrier stowed around 36 of these lethal fish, which had just been introduced in the previous few months. Torpedoes were, and still are, complex, finicky beasts, yet they were worth their high cost and maintenance headaches because of their capacity to inflict enormous damage on an enemy ship. The new Type 91 packed a powerful 140 horsepower engine into its 17.7-inch diameter frame, along with guidance gyroscopes, depth-keeping gauges, steering motors, and a dozen other highly technical pieces of equipment, not to mention a 529-pound warhead. It was capable of reaching speeds of 42 knots over a 2,000-yard range, substantially better performance than its American counterpart. The Type 91 had a reputation of being extremely reliable if it was taken care of, and the torpedo handlers in Cardiff 1 were experts at this. Each fish had been scrupulously maintained, having been checked the day before to ensure that it was topped off with distilled coolant water, kerosene fuel, and engine oil. Their air flasks had been charged to 2,560 psi on a special compressor that ran off an imported German 2-cycle diesel in the torpedo maintenance room just forward of the magazine. Now the men performed last-minute checks to ensure that the detachable wooden tail fins and rubber nose cap, both of which shattered on impact and thereby absorbed the shock from a high-altitude launch, were securely in place. Finally, the running depth of each torpedo was set at a relatively deep 5 meters. If any enemy forces were detected, it was assumed that they would contain capital vessels, and with torpedoes it was best to hit the target as low in its hull as possible. One by one, the gleaming, greasy fish were secured by their attachment lug to the overhead tram, wrestled onto the ordnance lift, and sent up to the hangars. Once there, the torpedoes were trundled out to Cardiff 1's Type 97 aircraft, using the same sort of carts that had been employed earlier in the morning to load the heavy Type 80 bombs. However, the Type 97 used different Tokaki mounting brackets for a torpedo than the 800 Kylyu Bomb A, fact that would have important implications later in the day. The torpedo Tokaki had been attached the previous day to the aircraft of Cardiff 1. Meanwhile, on board Cardiff 2, the dive bombers were fueled and had their machine guns munitioned, but were left otherwise unarmed. They would be armed on the flight deck as usual when spotted. Until that time, the entire reserve strike force on all 4 carriers would be kept below in the hangars. This last point is an important one, and is contrary to the common wisdom that has been passed down from Fuchida's book to innumerable Western texts on the battle. At no time during the morning prior to 1000 was the reserve strike force ever spotted on the flight decks. Spotting the reserve force at 0500 or so would have required breaking the spot once the initial cap fighters began returning to their ships around 0700. Getting the aircraft back off the deck would require between 20 and 30 minutes, representing a needless decrease in the flexibility of the flight decks, as well as a colossal waste of labour. Everyone in the hangar crews sincerely hoped that if the Americans were sighted this day, that there would be no repeat of the rearming snafus that had plagued Kid Butai in the recent Indian Ocean operation. While leading the aerial attack force home after bombing Colombo on the morning of April 5th, Commander Fuchida had recommended to Admiral Nagumo that the reserve aircraft be readied for a follow-up strike against the same target. But those second-wave planes had already been armed for anti-ship duties, just as today. Nagumo had gone ahead and ordered the changeover at 0853 that morning, and it had been nearly complete by the time the initial strike waves were landed at 0948. Then, at 1000, a sighting report had come in advising the fleet of the presence of 2 British cruisers, Dorsetshire and Cornwall, heading southwest away from Ceylon at high speed. After some deliberation, at 10:23, Nagumo had given the order to rearm the reserve aircraft with anti-ship weapons once again. The armament shuffle had not gone smoothly among the force's torpedo planes. Finally, in exasperation, Cardiff 2 went ahead and launched its force of dive bombers against the British warships at 1200, a full 2 hours after the initial sighting report. Even then, the Type 97s aboard Shikaku and Zuikaku still had not been ready. In the event, it hadn't altered the outcome a wit Cardiff 2's dive bombers had sunk the 2 British cruisers with dispatch, but Admiral Nagumo had been understandably livid at the delays. However, on this morning in June, the men had complete confidence in the reserve strike force. They were in every sense of the word Nagumo's A-team. Cardiff 1's torpedo aircraft were nominally led by Fuchida, but in his absence they would be commanded by Lieutenant Sea Dr. Murata Shigeharu. Murata was one of the finest torpedo bomber pilots in the entire Navy, and a veteran of Pearl Harbor. A training fanatic, it was Murata who had perfected the techniques needed to use torpedoes in the shallow waters of the Hawaiian operation. He had then moulded the Kank Tai of Kid Butai into a battle implement that could habitually achieve the tight launch parameters required for such a daring operation. During the attack itself, he had personally led his team in delivering the devastating torpedo attacks against Battleship Roe that had sunk Oklahoma, California, and West Virginia. Murata's opposite number on Kaga, Lieutenant Kitajima Ichir, led a similarly experienced group of pilots. On board SRI, Cardiff 2's dive bomber contingent was led by the famed Lieutenant CDR Egusa Takashige, universally acknowledged as the leading dive-bombing ace in the entire Navy. Possessed of a flamboyant personality, Egusa was regarded by Genda as a godlike combat leader. He and his men had terrorized their opponents with their startling prowess in the difficult art they practiced. It was Agusa's Kanbaku team that had crushed the Cornwall and Dorsetshire in April, sinking both cruisers in 5 minutes flat and scoring an unprecedented percentage of hits against the veteran warships. Agusa's counterpart on Hiri, Lieutenant Kobayashi Michio, was another well-respected veteran. If trouble arose, Nagumo clearly had a crack aerial team to deal with it. In contrast to the relatively smooth flight operations on the carriers thus far, the cruisers Tone and Chikuma were having a rough morning. Both cruisers were supposed to have gotten their aircraft, 3 apiece, into the air at 0430 along with the morning strike force. In the event, neither of them had been able to do so. Of the two, Chikuma at least had the good sense to launch the scout planes for lines Nosant 5 and 6 first, at 0435 and 0438 respectively, but then had taken another 12 minutes getting her anti-submarine patrol plane in the air. Tone had not fared even this well. Her initial plane, the anti-submarine scout, had been launched at 0438, and the scout plane for line number 3 had gone off at 0442. However, getting the number 4 scout plane launched took until 0500, a delay that smacked of incompetence on someone's part. This plane, piloted by PO-1C Amari Hiroshi, had experienced difficulties in getting off the catapult as the result of circumstances that remain murky. Perhaps he had engine problems or an issue with the catapult itself. Float plane takeoffs were more dangerous than a carrier launch. Even with engines running full out, the plane still had to be hurled off the end of the catapult by an explosive charge, accelerating it to 62 mph within the space of 50 feet. At such whiplash-producing accelerations, even the slightest pilot miscalculation or mechanical mishap meant instant death. If there were some sort of mechanical fault evident, Amari probably wouldn't have wanted to take off until all systems had checked out fully. However, others have suggested, including Chikuma's Sheikh Cheche, Lieutenant Kuroda Makoto, that the orders for getting the float planes aloft were simply not forthcoming, keeping the pilots waiting on board ship past the appointed hour. Kuroda then went to the bridge to see what was going on. However, Chikuma's commander, Captain Komura Keizo, had not the slightest recollection about reasons why their departure was delayed. Tone's assistant communications officer recalls the pilots simply waiting around for orders to depart, not any equipment failure. Indeed, other sources have suggested that Tone's catapult officer was unfamiliar with the equipment and took longer than he should have to get the launch underway. According to both Genda and Kusaka, no communications apparently passed between the cruisers and the fleet flagship apprising Nagumo of the delay. Perhaps in the context of a 4-hour recon mission, 30 minutes either way didn't really matter to either Admiral Abe or Nagumo. However, on board Hiri it was a very different story, because both Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku were exceedingly vexed at the various delays and decried the apparent incompetence of Crew Div 8. Whatever the reason for the delay, the effect was to further degrade the efficiency of an already porous search pattern. As has already been related, Nagumo probably had never been under any illusions about the ability of Tomonaga's force to neutralize Midway with a single strike, particularly in the absence of Cardiff 5's attack squadrons. At 0520, he issued orders to the fleet to be prepared to launch a second strike. Unless unforeseen changes in the situation occur, the second attack wave, in Organisation Sura 4, under command of Air Officer Onkaga, will be carried out today. This merely confirmed what the armourers on Akagi and Kaga already suspected. At some point later in the morning, it would be necessary to replace the torpedoes on the Type 97s with land attack bombs. For the time being, however, there was nothing to do but wait. However, only 10 minutes later, about 0532, a number of flies began appearing in the ointment. First Nagara and then Kirishima, in the front of the formation, began laying down a smoke screen, an indication that their lookouts had seen something. An enemy flying boat had been sighted bearing 166 degrees, 40 kilometers away. The force had now been located for certain. Even now, enemy aircraft might be on their way in. Fighters already in the air scurried to drive the intruder away. Then, at 05:45, Tone's No. 4 plane radioed to announce that at 05:20 it had sighted not one, but two surfaced American submarines on the outward-bound leg of its search, just 80 miles from the force. Kid Butai began thickening its combat air patrol. Hyrie had already added a trio of Zeros at 0525, and Akagi followed suit with three more at 0543. At 0555, Tone's No. 4 search plane initiated the day's air actions when he radioed, "15 enemy planes are heading towards you." Unbeknownst to Nagumo, the Americans had not been idle this morning. Given their sighting of Tanaka's force the day before, they were now confident that their intelligence on Japanese intentions was correct. However, Captain Cyril Simard was equally concerned that the Japanese might try to hit his base at dawn on 4th of June. Accordingly, he had elected to steal a march on his opponents and begin flight operations before first light. Commencing at 0350, he began launching a dawn cap of Wildcats to cover the takeoff of the base's bombers and search planes. 22 Catalina PBYs had subsequently taken off from the lagoon and eastern island at C415 to search radially all around the island. Shortly thereafter, 15 B-17s had been sent aloft with instructions to hit Tanaka's convoy again, but to be ready to be redirected to the north if Nagumo's carriers were detected. The rest of the island's aircraft were kept on the ground, armed, fueled, and manned. As for the American carriers, they had commenced air operations at roughly the same time as their Japanese counterparts. TF-17 and Yorktown, the northernmost of the two American task forces, was slated to search the northern flank, although Frank Jack Fletcher was relying on Midway to perform most of the reconnaissance work this day. At 0420, Yorktown sent aloft 10 of her SBDs for this purpose. However, these aircraft were slated to search out to only 100 miles and to return within 2 hours. Yorktown also sent up 6 KP fighters at this time. 10 miles to the south, TF-16 had eschewed a cap of its own, instead spotting Hornets and Enterprise's strike aircraft on the flight deck in readiness for any sighting reports that might arrive. By 0500, a temporary lull had settled over Midway and the American carriers. For the island, though, all that had changed in short order. Lieutenant Howard P. Addy's PBY had detected Nagumo's carriers at around 0530 and broadcast as much at 0534. Shortly thereafter, another PBY, flown by Lieutenant William A. Chase, sighted Japanese aircraft inbound and radioed in plane at 0544, many planes heading Midway. Chase subsequently sighted the Japanese fleet as well, transmitting at 0552, 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320 distance 180 course 135 speed 25. Crucially, Chase only reported seeing 2 Japanese flat tops. In fact, this would set the pattern for every American sighting report of the day. Given the broken cloud cover and Kid Butai's dispersed formation, almost no American aircraft would report seeing more than 2 carriers at any given time. Addy and Chase's report, while electrifying, created difficulties for Admiral Fletcher. He had been apprised by Chester Nimitz that the Japanese might be operating their carriers in 2 groups. If the PBYs had only seen 2 carriers, that might mean that another Japanese task force lay still undetected somewhere to the west or southwest. As such, Fletcher believed it would be wise to withhold some of his striking power to deal with the second group if and when it was located. It was essential, though, to attack the first Japanese task force as expeditiously as possible. Accordingly, he ordered Raymond Spruance at 0607 to proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers as soon as definitely located. As for his own force, Yorktown was committed to recovering the morning search SBDs in short order and was heading east into the wind to do so, thus moving him away from the Japanese. As such, it would take TF-17 some time to make up the lost ground to be in a position for launching his own strike. Fletcher informed Spruance that TF-17 would follow TF-16 to the southwest as soon as his search aircraft were recovered. If another Japanese carrier group was detected during the interim, Fletcher would retain enough firepower to deal with at least one additional enemy flight deck, even if Spruance had already fully committed his aircraft to destroying the first group. If, however, no further enemy carrier groups were detected, Fletcher would be able to back up Spruance's initial strike. For his part, Spruance wanted to attack as soon as was practical, per Fletcher's orders to close and strike. However, he would have to wait a bit. According to his calculations, and those of his staff, he was approximately 175 miles from the reported position of the Japanese carriers. His shortest-ranged aircraft, the TBD torpedo planes and the Wildcats, both had about a 175-mile combat radius, theoretically putting the Japanese within striking distance. However, two factors militated against an immediate launch. First, Fletcher and Spruance couldn't be certain that Chase's spotting reports were accurate regarding their positions. In fact, Chase's report placed the Japanese 175 miles from the American carriers, when Kidd Butai was, in fact, more than 200 miles distant. Nor could the Americans be certain of what the Japanese fleet's movements would look like during the time Spruance's aircraft were heading toward the target. If the Japanese weren't exactly where expected, the attackers would have to perform additional searches to find them, burning more precious fuel. That might force some aircraft to drop out, weakening the overall impact of the attack. Second, the breeze was light this morning, meaning that when he turned into the wind to launch, he would have to ring his ships up to 25 knots to generate sufficient wind over the bow. TF-16 would thus be moving tangentially to the target at a high speed throughout the entire launch cycle, increasing the range still further. For both these reasons, launching now meant leaving no margin for error for his strike aircraft. Basic mathematics dictated that the most prudent course of action was to delay until Spruance had closed the range somewhat. He set 0700 as the fly-off time for both Enterprise and Hornet. Addy's and Chase's reports had spurred Midway into furious activity, which was compounded when the island's own radar detected Tomonaga's formation shortly thereafter. By 0600, every available American aircraft had been scrambled. An odd-lot assemblage of 20 Brewster Buffalo and 4 Grumman Wildcat fighters started climbing to intercept the incoming Japanese. Meanwhile, Midway's attack aircraft stayed low and headed northwest, intending to discover Nagumo's carrier force. Behind them, Coller Harold Shannon's Marines readied every anti-aircraft weapon at their disposal. The rest of the American defenders braced themselves for the inevitable attack, the first of the day's desperate pitched battles. Its results would be known to the Americans as they happened. For the Japanese commanders of Kidd Butai, however, the full details surrounding Tomonaga's mission would remain unknown for almost another 3 hours. Back on board Kidd Butai, the possibility of imminent air action had spurred S. Rye into launching 3 fighters to augment the Combat Air Patrol, CAP, at 600. Hyrie followed suit at 6-2. Lookouts now scanned the sky intently. Unlike the American ships, none of the Japanese ships at Midway had radar. This fundamental fact vastly complicated the ability of the force to defend itself against American air attacks. At this point, the Japanese Navy was at least 2 years behind the US Navy in development in this critical field, and was only just beginning to deploy its first operational sets to the fleet. The test beds for this new technology, the battleships Ice and Haigar, had experimental sets installed just a week before the sortie of Takasu's force for Operation AL. However, none of the Midway ships carried such devices. To detect incoming aircraft, the Japanese still completely relied on the Mark I eyeball, with all of the vagaries and stress-induced phantasms that it was prone to. Japanese lookouts, at least when it came to surface warfare and spotting enemy ships, were better than most. But the broken cloud cover this morning made for a frustrating exercise, because aircraft could use it to their advantage. The burden of aircraft detection fell primarily on the escort destroyers, which had been deliberately pushed far enough away from the carriers that they could provide some modicum of early warning. Once an incoming raid was spotted, the question remained how to communicate that information to the Cap fighters. The aircraft radios carried on the Zero fighter were of inferior quality and of limited range and power, and were difficult to use. As a result, while all carrier Zeros had radios, pilots rarely relied on them. Not only that, but communications with all aircraft aloft Cap, reconnaissance and strike forces was apparently conducted via a single radio frequency, making it difficult for the various formations to be fed just the information that was pertinent to them. Shipboard fighter control was haphazard at best. There was no such thing as a Combat Information Center, CIC, in the sense of a centralized facility responsible for pooling and coordinating Cap assets and vectoring them onto their targets. Each carrier's HIK was nominally responsible for controlling his Cap fighters. In the absence of any practical means for doing so, however, and burdened by running the flight deck as well, it was impossible for the HIK to dedicate the sort of undivided attention to the Cap that it required. As a result, the Cap pretty much ran itself, attacking anything that came within visual range. When a ship spotted an incoming raid, it was standard practice to begin laying smoke to attract the attention of the aircraft above, as well as blinkering an alert to the carriers in the center of the formation. Sometimes the ship would also fire a few salvos from its main battery in the direction of the enemy to generate splashes, which would in turn draw the attention of the fighters overhead. The weakness of these command arrangements, if they can be called that, are readily apparent. The Japanese CAP was more of an understanding than a true system for air defense. It worked only so long as the enemy did not saturate the ability of the lookouts to detect them and the fighters to self-direct their formations to the attack. Against attacks that materialized sequentially, this approach worked moderately well. As events would show, however, against a multi-vector, multi-altitude threat, the Japanese system proved too brittle and slow to react. Worse yet, it relied far too much on the discipline of the individual fighter pilots, who could only rarely see the big picture, to somehow maintain an optimum distribution of fighters around the fleet. In fairness to the Japanese, both of the other carrier navies, US and Great Britain, were still groping their way through these same issues. Even with radar, the Americans still didn't have a good approach to handling fighter direction yet, but the fact remained that Japanese fighter defenses, while formidable, could be beaten. Beyond the primary protection that the fighters provided, there were three other factors that influenced the air defenses of the task force: the fleet's formation, the individual handling of the ships within that formation, and the lethality of the ship's anti-aircraft guns. The Japanese differed from the US Navy in their approach to all three areas, sometimes drastically. The fundamental issue of whether to disperse or concentrate one's carriers in the face of the enemy had been hotly debated on both sides of the Pacific during the years leading up to the war. Dispersal of flight decks into widely separated task forces held out the promise of reducing potential losses if one of the groups was attacked. However, dispersal also carried with it attendant problems of coordination. How, in conditions of radio silence, could one reasonably assure that the task forces could launch and attack an enemy together? Concentration, conversely, made coordination much easier, but it inevitably placed all of the force's eggs in one defensive basket. The Japanese had initially been champions of dispersal, and most of their wargaming and staff work up until 1937 had supported this viewpoint. However, the China War had conclusively demonstrated two things to the Japanese. First, bombers could only achieve decisive results if they were employed en masse, and second, that bomber formations were inherently vulnerable to enemy fighters and therefore required strong escorts in order to achieve their missions. These factors, which were the foundation of their ability to mass offensive air power as well as they did, began to move the Japanese away from the view that dispersal was the best way to employ their carriers. This movement was confirmed in fleet maneuvers carried out in 1939-0, which demonstrated the difficulties of offensive coordination between dispersed assets, a fact that the Americans would learn to their cost on this very day. By the time 1st Air Fleet was formed, the idea of operational dispersal had essentially been abandoned. The basic carrier formation that was eventually adopted by 1st Air Fleet and used by Kid Butai during most of the engagements of the war thus far was a box. At Midway, this basic configuration remained in place. With 8,000 metres between ships, this was very loose formation, allowing the carriers a good deal of sea room to operate. Intriguingly, too, other than the individual plane guard destroyers, there were no escorts anywhere near the flat tops. Thus, it was up to the carriers to fend for themselves against air attacks. It should be noted, too, that contrary to some Midway accounts that describe the Japanese escorts as being in a ring around the carriers, this is not strictly correct. At this point in the war, the concept of a tight ring formation optimized for anti-aircraft screening, i.e., the active defense, via combined gunpower, of a capital ship, was unknown to the Japanese. While both the US and Royal Navies were already using such defensive alignments, ring formations did not appear in Japanese doctrine until mid-1943. During the course of 4th of June, those destroyers that were not assigned as plane guards were pushed out to the extreme perimeter of the formation to act as air raid warning pickets. Thus, while the formation might have appeared as a ring from the air, the escorts on the perimeter were there for different purposes than an American ring formation and were much farther out from the high-value vessels. On the face of it, dispersing the escorting vessels might be considered poor doctrine on the part of the Japanese. But as we will see, the majority of the defensive firepower in the formation actually resided with the carriers themselves. Given this, the placement of the destroyers on the perimeter made good sense, because it bought time for the cap to react to incoming threats. As much as possible, the Japanese wanted to reduce the number of times the carriers had to engage aircraft with their guns to an absolute minimum. Akagi's anti-aircraft outfit was the weakest of the four. Her heavy AA armament had yet to be upgraded to the more modern 5-inch 40 caliber guns that were now prevalent throughout the Navy. She was still equipped with older 4.7-inch 45 caliber weapons, which possessed neither the rate of fire nor the maximum elevation of the newer gun. In fact, Akagi was slated for an overhaul that would have upgraded her fire control equipment and replaced her mounts with the newer 5-inch model as soon as she returned from Midway. Not only were her guns outdated, but the sky arcs for her 4.7-inch battery were bad as well. Instead of having her heavy mounts distributed around the 4 quadrants of the ship, they were grouped amidships and relatively low on the hull. She had no means to bring large-caliber fire to bear either directly forward or aft. On the port side, the island blocked the forward arcs of the port battery even further. If a target dove from directly overhead, particularly from the region of the port bow, the 4.7-inch guns would have a very difficult time aiming at it, meaning that only the 25mm weapons would be able to fire. This made Akagi particularly vulnerable to dive bombers. Kaga had her own difficulties in the gunnery department. While she sported the newer 5-inch 40 gun, her fire control system was the older Type 91 model, rather than the Type 94 that was used on the other 3 carriers. Fire control, the rather arcane science of how a ship's guns are aimed at a target, is often neglected in favour of focusing on the raw characteristics of the weapons themselves. However, a weapon itself has no intrinsic usefulness unless it can hit its target, and in this rather vital respect, Kaga was sadly lacking. The Type 91 Koshaki, Director, which was first deployed in 1931, was a slow, manually trained model lacking many of the power-assisted features that helped Type 94 maintain a bead on a fast-moving airplane. Type 91 was designed at a time when combat aircraft did not exceed speeds of 200 mph, and dive bombing was still in its infancy. In the early 1930s, it was still thought that the greatest danger to a ship came not from dive bombers or torpedo aircraft, but from level bombers attacking at high altitudes. Aircraft attacking a ship in this manner were obligated to fly straight and level, in order for their bomb sights to make an accurate fix on the target. Unfortunately, in the intervening decade, aircraft performance, as well as dive bombing technique, had improved enormously. Flying straight and level, as any of Kid Butai's own dive bomber pilots would readily have attested, was a charming anachronism rarely witnessed in modern combat. Contemporary aircraft, when piloted by skilled men, manoeuvred constantly and made their attack runs at frightening speeds. Against these targets, Type 91's only recourse was to direct the guns to fire a barrage. Contrary to the popular lexicon, in which the word barrage implies firing roughly that away with everything you've got, barrage fire has a very precise meaning in the parlance of the gunnery officer. Placing a barrage means creating an imaginary box in the sky at some preset range and altitude, and then pumping shells into the box as quickly as possible. The effect is to create a zone of exploding flak through which an enemy plane must fly on its way to the target. The advantages of this method are that it doesn't take much time or thinking to create a good barrage. All the shell fuses are set to a given range, and the guns are shooting at an unmoving point. Over a short period, this method can deliver impressive output from the guns. However, barrage fire also has a crucial drawback, in that once a plane has made it through the barrage, it is effectively home free. A barrage is a one-shot deal. If it fails, the target vessel can be reasonably assured that enemy ordnance will soon be incoming. Even the newer Type 94 systems on Akagi, Soryu and Hiryu were scarcely better able to defend their ships against dive bombers. Type 94 was a fully tachymetric system, meaning that it was designed to track and aim against individual targets moving in 3 dimensions. It was theoretically capable of tracking a plane moving at 500 knots, but in reality, the system was not nearly fast enough to engage such a target. Dive bombers, for instance, hurtled downward at 225 knots, shedding appalling chunks of altitude as they went. In the process, they created large vertical rate changes that made life very difficult for an opposing fire control director. Not only that, but while the nominal range of the 5-inch 40 weapon was about 14,000 meters, in actual use the Japanese figured it was only good out to about 7,000 meters, with a useful ceiling of about 3,000 meters. This meant that under normal combat conditions, even the 5-inch weapon had difficulty engaging a dive bomber before it reached its pushover point. Once it reached that point, it would deliver its ordnance in under a minute. It wasn't that Type 94 was a bad system. It was roughly on par with the US Navy's basic Maurauder director, although when the Maurauder was paired with radar inputs, its effectiveness was greatly enhanced. Being fully tachymetric, Type 94 was certainly better than anything the British currently used. In fact, it was probably the best AA fire control system deployed on any Axis warship at this time. But it couldn't cope with a dive bomber. Even with an experienced crew, it took Type 94 a minimum of 10 seconds, and often as long as 20, to establish a fire control solution for the target. Obviously, if a ship was caught unaware, spending the first 20 seconds of a minute-long engagement window waiting for the computer to generate a solution was hardly conducive to its survival. The end result was that a dive bomber, once it reached pushover, was an almost insuperable weapon system. At shorter ranges, of course, ships also relied on their machine guns to provide additional defensive fire. Light AA weapons compensated for their relatively crude fire control arrangements by simply putting a large number of bullets in the air and hoping something hit. The Japanese were no exception in this regard. Their light AA fire control system, the Type 95 Koshaki, was essentially a glorified telescope with an etched glass ring sight that transmitted training and elevation data to the guns it nominally controlled. It was then up to the gun crews to follow the pointer of the director and hose down the target. The standard Japanese light AA weapon was the Type 96 25mm automatic gun. It was a copy of a French Hotchkiss design and had been in licensed production in Japan since 1936. Most of the 25mm mounts in the fleet were twin-barrel models, although Hiryu had a number of the newer triple mounts. It was generally well liked by the Japanese, but it suffered from some important drawbacks. First off, its rate of fire was badly hampered by its ammunition supply, which came in a 15-round box. These clips had to be changed frequently, chopping the gun's nominal rate of fire in half to only about 130 rounds per minute. With a full clip, the 25mm had around a 4-second burst before it needed to be reloaded. As a result, it was standard Japanese practice to fire only one barrel of a double or triple mount at a time. In this way, the gunner was able to put sustained fire on a target while the other barrels were being reloaded. Obviously, this was a poor substitute for being able to blaze away with full firepower when it really counted. It must be noted, though, that against a dive bomber, the target might not be within the 25mm effective range long enough for the problems of changing out magazines to be terribly pertinent in any case. The engagement window against such targets was very small. This points out another flaw of the 25mm weapon, namely that it didn't have the range or hitting power it needed. While nominally effective out to 8,000 meters, Japanese gunners routinely held their fire until the target was within 2,000 meters. Against a torpedo airplane, the 25mm could be an effective weapon. Given their need to launch their weapons below a given altitude, torpedo planes were inherently more constrained in their vertical movements. This eased the gunner's problem by making his fire control solution much more two-dimensional. However, against a dive bomber, the equation was more complicated, because the target was moving in all 3 dimensions and much more rapidly to boot. In the case of both heavy and light guns, a single director controlled a battery composed of between 2 and 4 weapon mounts. On the Midway carriers, the heavy AA batteries were grouped port and starboard into batteries of 3 or 4 twin mounts apiece. With the lighter guns, Soryu's and Hiryu's 25mm mounts were grouped into 5 batteries, 2 on each side and 1 at the bow. Kaga's and Akagi's automatics were subdivided into 6 light batteries, 3 per side. The important point here is that the total number of aircraft that could be engaged at any one time by a carrier was really not equal to the number of gun mounts, but rather to the number of fire control directors, and hence the number of batteries. Thus, 7 or 8 aircraft composed the theoretical maximum that any of the carriers could protect itself against at any one time. In practice, this number was actually much lower, as multiple 25mm batteries tended to be concentrated against a single target. Consequently, even a large ship's defensive systems could be swamped fairly easily if the cap fighters didn't thin out the attackers beforehand. AA was therefore really only useful for stopping leakers. The other major defense the Japanese carriers had against their attackers was the ship's helm. The Japanese viewed maneuver as a primary mechanism to defeat incoming aircraft. This approach had pros and cons. A skilled skipper could usually make life very difficult against a slow-attacking aircraft, such as a torpedo plane, particularly against the Americans, where both components of the weapon system, torpedo and plane, were subpar in terms of speed. Simply executing a sharp turn to place the aircraft astern could complicate their attack greatly. Such a maneuver presented the plane with a markedly longer approach and lengthened its exposure to fighters and AA fire accordingly. American airborne torpedoes, with a top speed of only 33 knots, were in roughly the same predicament. Both Hiryu and Soryu could outrun the American fish outright, and even against Kaga and Akagi, they had little chance of hitting unless the Americans laid down a perfectly timed attack from several directions. However, using violent maneuvers to throw off attackers had its downsides as well. In the first place, it made it very difficult for any escorting ship to stay close enough to the carrier to add effective firepower to her defense. The chances of collision with one's charge were very real under such circumstances, and destroyers knew they had to keep their distance, although with the bulk of the Japanese destroyers pushed out to the perimeter of the formation on 4th of June, this was less of a problem. However, radical maneuvers also badly degraded the ability of a fire control system to hit its target. Fire control computers were essentially mechanical slide rules that accepted numerous inputs such as target speed, target course, ship's own speed and course, and other variables. These were fed into the computer by a gang of crewmen. Sometimes as many as a dozen manned the computer alone, via dials and knobs. The result was then mechanically generated, displayed, and fed back to the guns. Putting the ship's helm over hard introduced rates of change into the system of several degrees per second for at least one crucial variable, known as ship's own course, making it very difficult to generate a meaningful solution for the guns. In fact, it was generally acknowledged that performing a radical turn threw the solution right out the window. Both the Japanese and American navies recognized this problem, but each adopted a different approach to it. The Japanese accepted the fact that fire control against aircraft was exceedingly difficult and continued to rely on the helm to evade attack throughout the war. Even as late as 1944, Japanese doctrine prescribed that, in AA combat, the normal procedure will be to maneuver at long range, avoiding as much as possible any reduction in the effectiveness of fire. When the enemy tries to attack at close quarters, the required evasive maneuvers will be executed, if necessary, without regard to development of firepower. This de-emphasis on firepower in preference for the helm was in marked contrast to American practice. American capital ships, knowing that they were closely surrounded by escorts that were actively contributing to their defense, tended to maneuver in such a way as to maximize the aggregate firepower of the group. Unless they were absolutely forced to, American vessels avoided radical maneuvers. U.S. doctrine in 1944 noted that while individual ships were allowed to maneuver to avoid a specific threat, this doctrine does not constitute an unrestricted license to individual maneuver. Lack of restraint exacts heavy penalties. Ships become scattered. Mutual support is lost. Risk of collision is added to the dangers of enemy weapons. The USN's approach would certainly make more sense by 1943, when the massed firepower from 5-inch 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons, coupled with radar direction, mounted on its warships would fill the air with almost impenetrable curtains of fire. In June 1942, though, the correct answer to the question of whether or not to maneuver was far less obvious. For one thing, at this stage of the war, firepower from both sides' escorts was minimal. The average destroyer in 1942 sported only a handful of light automatic weapons. Japanese tin cans often carried little more than a pair of twin 25mm mounts. Not only that, but their low-angle 5-inch guns, which were optimized for surface fighting, were practically useless as anti-aircraft weapons. They could neither elevate high enough nor train quickly enough to engage a fast-moving airplane. Consequently, the Japanese destroyers didn't have a lot to contribute in the way of screening fire. An examination of Kid Butai's aggregate AA firepower makes this fact clear. The 4 carriers between them mounted more than half the total usable AA barrels in the formation. In terms of throw weight, the actual weight of shells that could be fired within a given amount of time, the carriers accounted for nearly 60% of the force's total. Each of the carriers individually had twice the throw weight of light cruiser Nagara and all 11 of the force's destroyers combined. The only other ships in the force with any meaningful AA firepower were the 2 battleships and the heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma. However, unlike a destroyer, the handling characteristics of these large vessels made them less useful for taking up station close to a carrier, even if they had wanted to. To add to this basic problem, Tone's and Chikuma's duties as floatplane motherships, as well as indicating incoming raids to the cap by firing their main batteries at intruders, meant that they had their own matters to attend to. The battleships were high-value targets in themselves and manoeuvred independently. The result was that the only help that each carrier could likely expect in the event of an attack would come from its division partner, assuming it was close by. Given this state of affairs, preferring manoeuvre over firepower may well have been the right answer for the Japanese in mid-1942. However, it was hardly an answer derived from a position of strength, and the results of the coming battle would reflect this. Of the 146 American aircraft lost to all causes on 4th of June, only 2 would be confirmed victims of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. To this total can perhaps be added some of the aircraft written off as constructive losses by the Americans after the battle, but the point must also be made that these were aircraft that had lived long enough to deliver their ordnance and then make it home. Indeed, more American aircraft were lost in landing accidents than from Japanese flak. The final point that must be made about Japanese anti-aircraft procedures is that the Japanese themselves probably did not know just how weak their defences actually were. Except for an isolated incident in the Indian Ocean, Kid Butai had never really faced a concerted air attack. There, on 9 April, a flight of 9 British Blenheim bombers operating out of Ceylon had managed to penetrate the striking force's cap without being detected. Hiryu had observed the incoming enemy, but had inexplicably failed to pass along a warning to the rest of the force. The first indication that anyone on Akagi had that something was amiss was when waterspouts off the flagship's starboard bow announced the thundering arrival of 9 sticks of bombs dropped from an altitude of 10,000 feet. Scrambling fighters had then pursued the attackers, eventually shooting down all but 4 of the bombers. By all accounts, Kid Butai was somewhat chastened by this lesson. The official Japanese war history, Senshi Sosho, notes that the fact that the carrier strike force, with a combat patrol overhead, was bombed without being aware of it was an extremely serious matter. Hiryu's battle report for the mission noted that it was an absolute priority to improve detection facilities to deal with these threats. Having some of the world's foremost practitioners of the art of naval dive bombing on board, it should have been apparent that if the Blenheims had been Dauntlesses and not level bombers, Akagi might well have been critically damaged or even sunk. Yet there are no indications that any concrete measures had been taken by the Japanese to counter the threat posed by such attacks. For one thing, the Japanese may well have had too little experience with live firing their anti-aircraft weapons against enemies to have drawn any lessons. For another, they may simply have dismissed the enemy's ability to hit their ships. By the time American carrier pilots demonstrated conclusively at Coral Sea that they could hit anything that moved, it was a little late for the Japanese to reflect on these lessons before sorting for Midway. In the absence of any better arrangements, the only thing the Japanese could do under the circumstances was simply try harder not to be caught with their pants down. Nagumo had more to fret over than just the threat of incoming aircraft. He was also worrying about his own attack force. Tomonaga should have been approaching Midway about now. Finally, at 06:16, Akagi overheard a message. Tomonaga's radio operator, PO-1C Murai, was tapping out a message from the Hiryu strike commander to his force. Assault method number 2, wind 90 degrees, 9 meters, approach course 270 degrees. As anticipated, Tomonaga was attacking out of the east, so as to have the sun at his back. Apparently the wind over the target was gusty. 4 minutes later, Tomonaga was overheard giving the order to the formations to assume their attack positions. Another empty 15 minutes followed. Nagumo knew that his air forces were in battle to the south, but he knew absolutely nothing of the tactical situation over Midway and could do nothing to intercede. After the morning's discovery by the American PBYs, the question of surprising the base seemed moot. But how many enemy aircraft were still there? How stiff had their anti-aircraft defences been? Had Suganami's fighter escort been sufficiently powerful to brush aside their American opposite numbers? It was one of the most frustrating aspects of exercising command over a force that fought well beyond visual range, the powerless waiting, devoid of all but the most cursory information on the circumstances of battle, the supply of actionable battle data choked down to the anemic transmission rate of the force's radio telegraphs. The man commanding the most powerful carrier force in the world could do nothing but wait for the message orderlies. Every so often, one of them would run up to the bridge from Akagi's radio room and deposit the scanty fruit of Murai's telltale tapping. In the interim, Nagumo had little to do but stare out the bridge windows. Nothing further was heard until 0636, when Tomonaga radioed another message to his entire force. Assume penetration formation. This was an indication that Tomonaga wanted the various Chutai and Shutai, particularly the dive bombers, which necessarily had been scattered by their individual attack runs, to begin regrouping into an orderly formation, one that could defend itself. The actual bombing attack on Midway Save for the fighters strafing the target was now almost over, and the tedious process of rounding up the stragglers had begun. 9 minutes later, at 6:45, Tomonaga sent out his first message to the mobile striking force. We have completed our attack and are homeward bound. In the meantime, Akagi was setting up to cycle her cap fighters. Lieutenant Ibusuke Masanobu and his Shutai of 3 Zeros were warming up on the flight deck. They were sent aloft at 6:55, and the deckhands immediately prepared to take aboard PO-1C Tanaka Katsumi and the other 2 fighters that had flown the morning's first cap watch. These were brought down starting at 0659. Hiryu was starting to do the same, preparing to land Lotto Mori Shigeru and his 2 wingmen. By around 0630, out of sight and out of mind, Nagumo's meagre scouting arrangements had quietly gone to hell. The Chikuma aircraft flying the 6th search line, along bearing 54 degrees, had radioed Nagumo at 0649 that because of bad weather he was returning to base. The timing of his message indicates that he would only then have been reaching the outer end of his first search leg. Further south, flying the 77-degree search line, Chikuma's No. 1 plane was apparently hot-dogging it. Instead of flying below the cloud cover that dotted its route, this plane was flying above weather and merely peeking down through the clouds as the opportunity afforded itself. Either that, or it was badly off course. One of these explanations must be true, else by all rights it should have detected Task Force 17 sometime during its outbound leg. South of Chikuma No. 1, Tone No. 4 was continuing on its way along the 4th search line, down the 100-degree bearing. However, in retrospect, it seems almost certain that this aircraft was not flying along its intended route. Having started a half an hour late, Petty Officer Amari may have been intending to save Tone the trouble of doing a late recovery and was simply cutting his route short so as to make his appointed return time. Furthermore, there are indications that he may have had a run-in with an American PBY. Whatever the reason, though, instead of flying out to the full 300 nautical miles of his intended search, Amari was apparently either pushed off course and/or made his dogleg at about 220 miles. Had he not done so, he would not have been in position to spot the Americans shortly thereafter. Neither Amari nor any of his crew were to survive the war, and the truth is that no one knows exactly what route he flew that day or why he did so, leaving his movement open of Chikuma's No. 1 scout plane as a result of weather conditions, but he had no way of knowing that the other 2 aircraft were not doing their jobs. All he knew for certain was that he had heard no tidings at all from his disengaged flank. So far as he and his staff were aware, everything was going pretty much according to plan. Within an hour, though, he would be disabused of that notion in the most inconvenient way imaginable. At precisely 0700, Akagi finally received word from Tomonaga regarding the outcome of the morning's strike when another decoded transmission was brought up to the bridge. The strike leader's message was blunt enough. There is need for a second attack wave. Around the bridge, mental shoulder-shrugging was the order of the day, no big surprise there. 70-odd bombers had indeed been insufficient to put Midway out of business, just as many of the staff had foreseen. Now the question was what to do about it. The manner with which Tomonaga transmitted his message, which was clearly noted by the American Signals Intelligence Unit on Hawaii, also supports the picture of a force that knew all along that it would have to strike Midway again this day. Tomonaga's message a single code group repeated 3 times. Kawa 0400 was strongly reminiscent of the famous Tora 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 signal used at Pearl Harbor, and is indicative of a prearranged message format. No matter what Yamamoto's instructions had been regarding only needing to hit Midway once, it seems clear that Nagumo's staff had arranged prior to Tomonaga's departure that the strike leader should have this certain code group in his back pocket if need be. Having sortied a day late, with less time to reduce the island before the landings, it is little wonder that Kid Butai had anticipated hitting the place more than once this day and had planned accordingly. While Nagumo pondered Tomonaga's signal, Akagi prepared to reinforce the combat air patrol still further. As soon as Tanaka's previous threesome of Zeros had been brought on board and stowed down the forward elevator, the same elevator began bringing up more fighters. The next group of 5 aircraft to go up would include 3 from the 6th Kokutai, under the command of Lieutenant Kaneko Tadashi. Kaneko, a fine pilot, who would go on to make ace, was just itching to get into action. Commander Masuda, Akagi's Hikocho, had seen no reason not to use the cargo aircraft in this fashion. Spotting began a little before 0700. Soryu was spotting 3 fighters of her own. Both ships sent their Zeros up at 0710, just as the first real American attack developed. Japanese lookouts on Akagi spotted enemy planes coming in low at 0710. Captain Aoki turned the flagship to head into them. Probably none of the men on the bridge recognized these particular aircraft. They were, in fact, 6 of the Americans' new TBF Avenger torpedo planes and 4 twin-engined B-26 Maurauder medium bombers. Neither had earned much of a reputation in the Pacific War thus far. In fact, this was the first combat mission ever for an Avenger. Both types were big and robust, and the B-26 was blazing fast as well. The 2 American formations were coming in on the bows of the lead carriers. As far as the Japanese could tell, they were attempting a version of an anvil attack, except that instead of targeting a single ship on either bow, which might have produced results, they unwittingly chose to divide their attentions between the 2 division flagships Akagi and Hiryu. This was hardly surprising, given that one flight was manned by US Army aviators, the other by Navy flyers, neither of whom had had any opportunity to coordinate their attacks with their opposite numbers. Their near-simultaneous arrival at their objective was wholly unintentional. Akagi had several KP fighters up, including a Shutai led by W.O. Ono Zenji, a second under Lieutenant Ibusuke Masanobu, and now Lieutenant Kaneko's still launching formation. Kaneko headed straight toward the B-26s along with the rest of the flagship's complement. At the same time, Hiryu's fighters also swung into action. She had 7 in the air, including a Shutai apiece under PO-1C Hino Masato and WO Kodama Yoshimi. The 7th plane was that of PO-2C Sakai Ichiro, the final plane from Hiryu's first cap watch that had gone up at 0430. His flight mates Lieutenant Mori and wingman PO-2C Yamamoto Toru had already landed at 0700, but Sakai had not yet made it down and apparently decided to peel out of his landing approach to join in the fray. Soryu's and Kaga's fighters also contributed, although it is likely that they played more of a role in the latter stages of the action. Kaga's first cap watch of 2 planes under the very senior PO-1C Yamamoto Akira, and her second watch of 5 planes under ENS. Yamaguchi Hiroyuki both made their presence known. Soryu, likewise, sent at least 2 Shutai in to the attack, including PO-1C Harada Kaname's trio and the newly launched Lieutenant Fujita Iyozo and his 2 wingmen. Thus, Kid Butai dispatched a total of over 30 fighters to destroy the 10 American warplanes of this first raid. The American aviators quickly discovered that Japanese carrier fighter pilots were every bit as good as their reputations made them out to be. Kid Butai's fighters set upon the interlopers like wolves. For their part, though, the Japanese found the B-26s speedy and difficult to bring down. Not only that, but the sleek American bombers had decent defensive armament as well. Akagi's PO-3C Hanyu Toichiro discovered this fact to his cost, killed by a marauder's fire during the engagement. The Avengers, too, exacted a price, splashing the late-landing Sakai within sight of his ship. Yet the Zeros methodically slashed at the bombers with well-timed runs, culling them out of their groups and bringing them down. They hurled at least one of the marauders flaming into the sea, probably at the hands of the skilled Lieutenant Kaneko. To the north, Lieutenant Fujita's flyers began scoring heavily on the Avengers. The Americans could do little but grimly hang on, boring in low and fast. The Avengers were savaged, all but one of them eventually being destroyed. The few American aircraft that managed to remain aloft were in tough shape as well, all of them holed dozens or even hundreds of times. Yet despite the prodigious punishment they meted out, the cap couldn't bring all of the attackers down before they reached their drop points. On board Hiryu, Second Lieutenant Nagayasu Yasukuni, commander of her starboard 5-inch guns, gave the order to commence firing. Hiryu cranked up to flank speed, 34 knots, and turned hard to port to unmask her starboard batteries. Across the way, Akagi was doing the same, and Tone, Chikuma, and Nagara were all blazing away as well. Finally, under heavy attack, several of the planes launched their torpedoes. To the cool eyes on board the carriers, it was clear that the Americans weren't very good at this sort of thing. They had dropped their fish much too far away. Yet drop them they did, and their targets had no choice but to react. Nagara had been targeted by an Avenger pilot who had dumped his torpedo at whatever ship was closest, thinking his badly shot-up plane was about to go in the drink. Hiryu simply ran away from the pair that had been launched against her. Meanwhile, Captain Aoki first threw his big ship into a looping port turn to avoid the torpedoes being aimed at Hiryu by the Avengers, then executed a neat 180 back to starboard to avoid the fish dropped by the surviving B-26. In the process, Akagi received a strafing from one of the Marauders as it roared overhead after its attack. The flagship's No. 2 machine gun mount suffered some minor damage, and 2 men were killed. The American aircraft were suddenly gone, except for one. This particular B-26, having been hit by Akagi's automatic weapons, made no effort to pull out of its run. Instead, he bored in directly at Akagi's bridge, where Nagumo and his staff stared wide-eyed back at their assailant. The plane was either unnavigable, or the American pilot, knowing his life was forfeit in any case, had decided to sell himself dearly. The bridge watch was stunned. Americans weren't supposed to show this sort of bravery. Then reflexes took over, and the men ducked as the American plane barreled in. There was no chance of it missing now. But instead of an explosion, the green bomber somehow flashed past the top of the island and cartwheeled into the sea. Nagumo and his staff let out a collective shout of relief. How it had missed, no one knew, but that had been too close by half. If Tomonaga's message 15 minutes earlier hadn't already decided matters for Nagumo, the determined self-sacrifice of this particular marauder may well have done so. Having just evaded torpedoes, been strafed, and then nearly been turned into a bomber hood ornament, Nagumo's blood was up. Enough was enough. It was clear that Midway was still full of fight, and until the island was neutralized, it would be a threat. The Americans had not been terribly skilled, but everyone on the bridge had just witnessed firsthand how important luck was in combat. Had the American plane been 10 feet lower, Akagi's island would have been given a daisy cutter, and the staff of 1st Air Fleet would have all been killed outright. It was time to put the American base out of business. However, attacking Midway in an effective manner meant disobeying direct orders from Yamamoto that the striking force keep its reserve aircraft armed for anti-ship operations. Nagumo has been endlessly pilloried for deciding to violate this order. Yet very few people have reflected on the practical implications of not doing so, or on whether Yamamoto's order was sound in the first place. Had Nagumo rigidly adhered to his superior's wishes, what were his realistic options for beating down the island's defences? Was he simply to let Tomonaga's men go back out later in the day to finish the job? Nagumo, after all, had absolutely no detailed information regarding the state of the island after Tomonaga's attack. All he knew was that his flight leader had thought a second strike necessary. Relying on only half of his force to single-handedly bring about Midway's destruction, even over the course of multiple attacks, really didn't make much sense. Tomonaga's air group was bound to take losses in the process, and as it did so, it would become weaker even if the enemy was correspondingly weakened as well. Yet Yamamoto's orders presumably would have kept Egusa and the rest of the A-team sunning themselves on the flight decks while Tomonaga and his men beat themselves bloody. The whole idea was simply asinine. Genda certainly agreed with this assessment, remarking after the war that Yamamoto's instructions were inflexible. He added that if the order had been adhered to, one half of the attack force would be kept idle unless a suitable enemy target was located. A decision should have been made depending upon the circumstances. Kusaka, too, felt that it was intolerable for the commander at the front to keep his half-strength in readiness indefinitely only for an enemy force which might not be in the area after all. Both men were absolutely correct in their judgment. The job of Admiral Nagumo and his staff was to craft timely, appropriate responses to the conditions then pertaining. Regarding Midway, one approach that strongly recommended itself at this juncture was reducing Kid Butai's own casualties by bringing overwhelming power to bear on the enemy, an approach to warfare that has been highly regarded since mankind first started sharpening sticks. If no American warships were nearby, it clearly made sense for Nagumo too. Attack Midway with as large a follow-up strike as possible in order to force the, presumably, depleted enemy into an even more unfavourable attritional spiral. There was another practical reason for violating the order, that of time. Regardless of what condition Tomonaga's group came home in, it would be a matter of several hours before they could be turned around for another attack. Planes had to be refueled and rearmed, damaged aircraft patched up, and the pilots debriefed and fed. Replacement aviators would need to be slotted in for the crewmen who had been wounded. A new mission plan would have to be created, the pilots briefed, and then the attack force armed, fueled, spotted, and launched. This probably could not have happened before the early afternoon. Giving the enemy more time to lick his own wounds and recover made no sense whatsoever. It was far better to hit the Americans again as quickly as possible, preferably while their aircraft were on the ground and being refueled. Here, in the cold light of combat on the morning of 4th of June, Yamamoto's earlier order was revealed for what it was, twaddle. Concocted in the unreal atmosphere of May's war games, his instructions contained no operational parameters and no indications as to when Egusa's force could be considered available for land attack operations. Was Nagumo to reserve these aircraft until the outward-bound legs of the recon flights were completed, or until the scouts returned to Kid Butai, or simply forever? Apparently no one knew. Yamamoto's order, if literally interpreted, essentially condemned Nagumo to fight with one hand tied behind his back, pitting Tomonaga's strike group against Midway in a pathetic race to see who limped to impotence first. Had Yamamoto truly been concerned about the U.S. Navy making its presence felt in the initial phase of operations, he should have backed up his reserve strike concept with requirements for a realistic scouting scheme and other contingency plans, so as to guarantee Nagumo's ability to deal with one opponent at a time. Instead, he had delivered a single flippant order verbally, almost casually, and without any set of guiding particulars or modifying conditions. When viewed in this light, it is almost impossible to anticipate Nagumo not making the decision to hit the island again with his reserve force at some point during the morning. Nagumo has also been castigated for not waiting to rearm his reserve aircraft until the morning's reconnaissance searches were completed. This criticism hits nearer the mark, in that, as will be seen, his relatively speedy decision to commence rearming deprived the force of vital time when a valid scouting report actually arrived. However, it should be remembered that by 07:15, the meaningful portions of the morning's searches were completed for all intents and purposes. The scout aircraft had now been aloft for nearly 3 hours. They had already run their outbound routes and were currently halfway through their left-hand doglegs as well. Within 15 minutes, all of them would be turning for home. As soon as that occurred, the symmetry of the search pattern would break down as the search planes began individually converging on Kid Butai. It was probably never expected that anyone would find anything on the inbound leg in any case. In the midst of these goings-on, Nagumo had been handed a message that had just been forwarded from Kaga. Kaga's Hikocho, see Dr. Amagai Takahisa, had apparently received a message regarding the effects of the Midway attack from Kaga's dive bomber leader, Lieutenant Ogawa Shoichi, at 0640. Ogawa reported that Sand Island had been bombed and great results obtained. Nagumo had only to recall the American Marauders boring in a few minutes previously to put Ogawa's optimistic assessment into proper perspective. Accordingly, at 0715, Nagumo sent the following message to the fleet. Planes in second attack wave stand by to carry out attack today. Re-equip yourselves with bombs. At 0720, Akagi took on board a single Zero. This plane, piloted by PO-1C Iwashiro Yoshio, had been airborne a grand total of 25 minutes. His shot-eye leader, later Ibusuke Masanobu, was still aloft with the cap. His wingman, Hanyu, was already dead. Iwashiro was likely out of cannon ammunition, having just experienced firsthand the amount of punishment American bombers could take and dish out before folding. This would become a common occurrence during the morning, with several Japanese fighters going up and coming right back down again after an attack. With 60 rounds of cannon ammunition for each of the Zero's 2 cannons, they weren't good for more than a few firing runs. Iwashiro's plane was quickly struck below. Down below, the hangar crews were beginning to carry out the rearming order issued 5 minutes previously. As will be recalled, the reserve strike aircraft had not been on the flight decks yet this morning. Consequently, there had been no need to send these aircraft back below to be worked on. Within the hangars, the 43 carrier attack planes on board Cardiff-1 were currently armed with torpedoes. These would need to be changed to Type 80 land bombs for the attack against the atoll. However, on board Cardiff-2, the 34 Kanbaku were still unarmed at this point because that normally occurred on the flight deck during spotting. Thus, none of them needed to be rearmed either. Nagumo's orders really only pertained in an immediate sense to the Type 97 aircraft on board Akagi and Kaga. Until Cardiff-1 had completed rearming, Cardiff-2 would wait to begin its spot. This represents a rather different vision of the rearming situation than has been portrayed in most texts on the battle, which have all 4 carriers engaged in frantic rearming activities at this time. On board Cardiff-1, though, the activity was real enough. Changing from torpedoes to bombs was no simple matter. Not only did it require removing the torpedo from the aircraft, it also entailed changing the mounting hardware, tokaki, on the belly of the aircraft. Unlike the dive bombers, whose main payloads were roughly the same size and shape whether they were high explosive or semi-armor piercing, the Type 97 aircraft carried ordnance that differed wildly in shape, requiring differently shaped mounting brackets as well. Thus, rearming with new ordnance was a complex multi-step operation. In Akagi, armourers pushed their 6 heavy carts out to the waiting kank and began the process of detaching the torpedo-carrying harness. They then lowered the torpedo onto the cart via the plane's winch. Once it was down, a team of handlers began pushing it gingerly through the crowded hangar and back to the ordnance elevator to take it back below. However, once the men arrived, they found the elevator already in use, hauling Type 80 bombs up to the hangar deck. Indeed, the bomb handlers in the magazines quickly let it be known that they had their hands full just getting the bombs out of storage and not to send anything down to them yet. The armourers on the hangar deck had little choice in the matter except to deposit their loads in the holding racks next to the ordnance elevator. Each carrier had sets of curving brackets attached to the hangar bulkheads near the bomb lift for temporary storage of ordnance in just such situations. One by one, the torpedoes were secured to the racks using block and tackle, and then the men moved the cart back to the elevator to receive the bomb. As always, the bombs came up in pieces. They would need to be assembled before they were attached to their planes. Meanwhile, back at the aircraft, another group of men was sweating to remove the old tokaki and get the new hardware screwed into the plane. This operation took some 20 minutes to perform amid the clatter of wrenches and the grunts of the armourers. Kaga was going through the same motions. She had a larger Kank squadron, but she also had 9 ordnance carts, as opposed to Akagi's 6. The net result was that the time needed to change Kaga's squadron over was identical. The limiting factor in the operation was not the number of aircraft, but rather the 1.3 ratio of carts to planes. All in all, it took around half an hour to rearm a Kanko, the bulk of the time being spent in changing the mounting hardware and assembling the bomb. Despite the portrayals of the entire hangar buzzing with activity, in truth, the action was rather localized. While the first Chutai was attended to, the maintenance crews for the other 12 Kanko of Akagi's group simply idled. Their mounting hardware couldn't be switched until the torpedoes were off, which in turn required a cart. With only 6 carts to go around, it was a long process, one marked by tedium for the crews waiting to get one, followed by frantic labour as they tried to replace the Tokaki as quickly as possible. Armed with this information, we can make some fairly accurate estimates concerning what Nagumo's options were at any given time during the morning. The math is reasonably straightforward: half an hour to rearm a single Chutai, 3 Chutai per carrier, and only 1 Chutai can be rearmed at a time, hence an hour and a half to rearm the lot. Once complete, about 45 minutes were then required to lift, spot, warm up, and launch the attack group. For dive bombers, a few minutes longer would probably be added on the flight deck for arming. All in all, it would not be unreasonable to assume that 2.5 hours would be required before the force could be completely rearmed, spotted, and warmed up for launch. This meant that at a bare minimum, with no interruptions, the reserve strike force would not be ready much before 09:30. This time estimate stands in contrast to estimates put forth in earlier Western tracts that suggest that an hour and a half might have been sufficient for sending off the second strike. Furthermore, it is clear from the foregoing that attacking Midway 2.5 hours from when the order was given with full deckload strikes from all 4 carriers was only achievable if everything went smoothly, above decks and below. This projected launch time obviously depended heavily on the speediness of the forthcoming recovery operations. Tomonaga's planes would begin orbiting the carriers at around 08:15, while rearming was still going on in the hangars of Cardiff 1. If the reserve strike was to be spotted starting at 08:45, i.e., an hour and a half from the time the rearming order was given, all of Tomonaga's strike aircraft would need to be recovered and stowed below to clear the flight deck for spotting. In the days before modern angled flight decks and deck-edge elevators, carriers could do only one thing at a time on their flight deck spot aircraft, launch aircraft, or recover aircraft. For all practical purposes, one operation could not be started until the other was complete. It is true, of course, that if Nagumo had given the word to attack promptly at 7:15, he could probably have struck Midway with just the dive bombers from Cardiff 2. These aircraft were as yet unarmed. They could have been spotted, armed, and launched by about 0800. However, this would have meant scrapping the idea of a coordinated strike with the 1st Carrier Division's Kanko, which were to operate in a level bombing role. Japanese doctrine, as we have seen, vastly preferred the idea of launching balanced deckload strikes, thereby gaining the benefits of combined arms. Consequently, a partial strike would probably not have been considered as an option at 0715. This made perfectly good sense. Midway wasn't going anywhere, and there were no indications as yet that there would be any difficulty in sending off a second strike after Tomonaga landed. Apparently in anticipation of needing the decks cleared for Tomonaga's return, several of the carriers began cycling their cap fighters. Kaga recovered 3 planes from her second watch at 0730, while across the way Soryu simultaneously brought down all 6 aircraft from her first 2 cap watches. At 0736, Akagi landed another lone 0, while Hiryu brought on board 2 fighters at 0740. At the end of these operations, Kido Butai had only 14 fighters aloft, down from the 31 it had up between 0710 and 0725. Akagi landed an additional plane at 0740, but it wasn't a fighter, but rather W.O. Suzuki Shigeru's Type 97 reconnaissance aircraft that had been launched with the morning strike. This aircraft had patrolled the No. 1 search line, flying almost due south. It had detected nothing. By about 0740, the rearming operations had been underway for about half an hour. Kaga and Akagi's first Chutai of Type 97s, 9 and 6 planes respectively, were both nearing the end of the rearming process, leaving 2 more Chutai to go on each ship. Both ships of Cardiff 1 were also currently holding a course into the wind in order to bring on board additional fighters. Suddenly, in the midst of these proceedings, came a bolt from the blue. Tone's No. 4 scout plane sent the following report. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface units, in position bearing 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. This was a stunning development because it stood every assumption of Yamamoto's plan on its head. Nagumo and his staff quickly huddled to discuss the implications. It is important to clarify the exact delivery time of Tone No. 4's message to the bridge of Akagi, because this matter has been subjected to great scrutiny. Nagumo's composite log indicates that the original signal was transmitted to Tone at 0728. It may well be that Amari had spotted the Americans sometime before this. It was the practice of Japanese search aircraft to work their way around the perimeter of an enemy formation before transmitting. Doing so would hopefully confuse the enemy as to the actual bearing back to the carrier force once the scout breached radio silence. As a result, we cannot know the exact time that Amari actually sighted the American force, only when he transmitted. It has generally been supposed that Amari's transmission made it up to Akagi's bridge sometime before 0745, because Nagumo's battle report logs an order at that time to reverse the earlier rearming order and to leave torpedoes on those attack planes which have not as yet been changed to bombs. However, at least one contemporary historian, Dallas Isom, has asserted that Nagumo actually did not receive Amari's transmission until 0800 or later. As part of this theory, it has been proposed that Nagumo's orders to reverse arming may have been misrecorded in the composite log that forms the basis of the Nagumo report. This notion is vaguely supported by Nagumo's own statement in the summary section of his report that Tony No. 4's message was not received until about 0800, and is repeated in other Japanese materials as well. However, in this particular case, it is clear that Nagumo did receive Amari's transmission about the same time it was logged in the Nagumo report. Furthermore, Nagumo thereupon acted on this information with great alacrity. This is confirmed not by Japanese sources, but by those of the enemy. At 0740, American radio intelligence logged Amari's third message of his flight thus far, reporting the initial sighting of the Americans. More important, American signals intelligence on Hawaii also noted a return transmission from Akagi at 0747, requesting that Tone No. 4 retain contact. Surprisingly, this signal was sent in the clear without being encoded. The impression one gets is that Nagumo was quite concerned at Amari's sighting report, enough so that the need for a speedy response to his scout apparently outweighed any need for signal security. Thus, the theory that Nagumo experienced a delay in receiving Tone No. 4's message cannot be supported. Likewise, it is clear that Nagumo did not dawdle in his deliberations. Upon receiving Amari's message, he immediately reversed his arming orders and then promptly asked for clarification from his scout regarding what had been seen. However, Isom is quite correct in noting that Tone No. 4's detection of TF-16 at 0728 was actually one of the few pieces of good luck that Nagumo was to receive this day. On the face of it, this seems an incredible statement. After all, Tone No. 4's tardiness in taking off has commonly been held up as one of the crucial Japanese failures during the battle. Yet, a careful examination of the American course tracks overlaid by the original Japanese search pattern provides an important revelation. Had Amari been launched promptly at 0430 and actually flown his route as prescribed in the original search plan, He would have flown well south of both American formations on his outbound route and would not have detected them until the inbound leg. This would have delayed his likely detection time until at least 800, meaning that Nagumo, in turn, would probably not have had an initial report in hand until closer to 08:15 or later. Not only that, but had Amari actually flown his prescribed route after his delayed launch, the situation would have been made worse still. It was only Amari's unauthorized truncation of his search pattern, or perhaps muddled navigation, coupled with his apparent decision to dogleg north at around 6:45, that put him in a position to make his initial sighting report, badly flawed though it was. The question then remains, what should Nagumo have done at this time? Finding the right answer to Nagumo's conundrum, if such even exists, has consumed endless gallons of ink over the years. Much of it, regrettably, has been spilled to little purpose. For without having a clear grasp of what the actual state of the Japanese force was, and what was and was not possible for their carriers in the way of operations, a meaningful analysis of Nagumo's options cannot be constructed. Since this was perhaps the critical point in the battle for Nagumo, it's worth spending the time to lay these issues out in detail. Nagumo's command decisions were governed by three primary constraints. The first was time. It's worth remembering at this juncture, reading at our leisure decades later in the quiet of a library or our own home, that Nagumo had approximately 15 minutes to find the correct solution to a set of operational problems whose outlines, because of the spotty intelligence endemic to this morning's actions, he only partially grasped. The second constraint was the physical arrangement of Akagi's bridge. Unlike us, Nagumo wasn't parked in an easy chair. Indeed, a factor that has been entirely overlooked until now is the nature of Akagi's command facilities and the effect these likely had on the Admiral's ability to reason clearly. Akagi's bridge was a tiny trapezoid, some 15 feet wide and 12 feet long. Containing little more than a small map table, a chart locker, and several sets of pedestal-mounted spotting binoculars, it was extraordinarily cramped. In this tiny space stood at least 5 officers: Nagumo, Kusaka, Genda, Captain Aoki, and Akagi's navigator, Commander Miura. In addition, if Fuchida's account is to be believed, several other individuals were present at least some of the time as well. Captain Oishi, Kusaka's senior staff member, Lieutenant C. Dr. Ono, Staff Intelligence Officer, Lieutenant C. Dr. Nishibayashi, Staff Flag Secretary, Commander Masuda, Akagi's Achik, and Fuchida himself. Of these, Oishi and Ono appear to have been present at all times. Fuchida apparently came and went at various points during the morning, and Nishibayashi was likely doing the same. Commander Masuda would perforce have been spending much of his time on the air control platform on the aft end of the island, one level lower, but would have been coming up to the bridge periodically to report to Captain Aoki on the state of air operation.